Welcome to the Expanding Consciousness podcast with your hosts, Michael Wally and Nikolas and Michael. In this podcast, we explore ways to sharpen our awareness, make life more enjoyable, be a little kinder, become more authentic, less reactive, more present, and ultimately expand our consciousness. We're happy to have you along for the ride, and if you do enjoy these conversations, please leave a review or a comment, as this goes a long way for us. Enough of the promotional talk and enjoy this episode. Welcome to podcast episode number 3. For today, we want to talk a little bit about cannabis, about our own experience with it, our positive and negative experiences, and particularly about the connection between spirituality and cannabis, which is, I have the feeling, a topic which is not talked about a lot, but there's a lot of potential there. So I'm super curious to hear about your experiences and exchange a bit on that. So without further ado, I would say let's jump into it. And maybe we start by going a bit through our own personal experiences. I'm curious to hear, what is your connection with the plant and what is your experience so far been?
Yeah. Thanks, Nick. So, I have a long and somewhat sordid history with cannabis. I first tried it out in my mid-teens. I'd drive off with a friend, park somewhere, and get high off some pretty low-quality stuff, and just sit around and laughing a whole bunch. Kind of fun experiences for sure. Once I got to college, I started using it a lot more frequently, pretty much daily use. And, that was, at the time, it was a bit of a social thing, quickly evolved, or you might even say devolved, into just regular use, on my own, pretty much all the time. Through most of college, I was smoking a lot. Honestly, that continued for probably about the next 20 years or so. I was smoking almost every single day for probably 20 years. And mainly it was just to feel good. It wasn't like any particular, a lot of times it would be kind of for de-stressing, to feel good at the end of the day, kind of just to zone out, play some video games, watch some cartoons or something. It wasn't very intentional, I guess I would say. And it evolved over time. More recently, I've actually pretty much stopped. I've used a few times more intentionally in sort of a spiritual context. But that's pretty much like the general overview of my history with it. How about yourself? What's your usage looked like over the years?
Well, I would say I also started in my teenage years to experiment with it, because back then it was kind of a cool thing to do and was fun thing to experiment with. Getting some giggles when smoking too much. Continued also through college. I would say this was my phase where I had the most intense use, but never on a level where I would smoke during the day. I would say for me it was always a thing to do just in the evening, to relax. But I realized that when I was using it daily, it was kind of negatively affecting my habits, and I was screwing up some of the courses at university. And once I realized that, I would say, okay, I don't need this thing right now. So I banned it completely, and then use it occasionally with, just in social settings, parties with friends and stuff. I would be interested, because you said you used it 20 years. What made you stop?
Yeah, really good question. A few times over the years, I had taken breaks. For example, for a while, I got really into like running, and I had stopped for, I don't know, maybe 6 weeks or something, and then picked it up again pretty quickly. And a few times in there, I tried to really intentionally stop. I felt like it was just, preventing me from being able to be as happy as I thought that I might be able to, like having a hard time just laughing, which is almost paradoxical to using marijuana. After a while, it seems to kind of numb some of your emotional life. Right. So more recently, what made me stop was I was going to go to a meditation retreat, and it was sort of contraindicated. And I just wanted to follow all of the guidelines to prepare for it. I didn't end up going to this particular retreat, but I kept off of smoking for the most part since then. That was actually the easiest time for me to stop. Past times I'd struggled with it a little bit. There was a lot more withdrawal, and it was just a little bit of a struggle, honestly. But the more recent time that I quit, I was able to do it, pretty easily. Honestly, it was a little bit surprising. There weren't, any significant side effects or anything from stopping. I wasn't losing a lot of sleep. I mean, my dreams were coming back, which was nice. Smoking all the time, I notice I really don't remember my dreams for the most part, but these days that's not an issue. And having smoked for so long, there was definitely some concerns that it was going to have more long-term type effects. I'd say it's kind of hard to actually gauge some of those things to some degree, since I had been smoking since my late teens. I don't know what sort of mental development I might have messed up or anything. But for the most part, I feel, pretty capable. I mean, I'm a software engineer, and I don't suffer relative to my peers. I'm able to perform and everything. So I don't think it's had any significant negative effects. And I would imagine most of the negative effects have pretty much subsided at this point. I mean, it's probably been, I've quit about 6 to 8 months ago, with only a few times in between. So for the most part, I think I'm pretty clean and clear. How does that match up with your own experience of it?
You mean of quitting?
Of quitting, and also if you've noticed any significant negative effects from smoking or anything.
So yeah, I had that negative experience that somehow I was becoming less motivated over time and lazy. But I wouldn't even blame it on the cannabis itself. It might have been just also a phase in my life, and this was just a thing that I was using back then. But what's interesting is that you said, since you were a software developer and you were able to work, honestly, that's the one thing I cannot do. If I smoke cannabis, my logical thinking mind goes out of the window, and programming is really difficult for me when I'm using cannabis. How was it for you? Were you able to smoke before work and then be productive at work?
Yeah. Sometimes I did. Don't tell any of my bosses. Every once in a while, I did. Usually, I was pretty sober and would wait till the end of the day. Though in college, when I was doing it, I was kind of one of those people. It's I really embraced the idea of study high, take the test high, get high grades, and I kind of proudly, I would say, maybe I shouldn't be proud of it, but I took my data structures final high and did pretty well. I think I aced it. I got an A in that class. And so yeah, I didn't find that it totally inhibited me. I think probably a lot of that is due to the fact that I was high all the time.
Yeah.
So I was fairly functional, right? I wouldn't smoke to the point where I was totally gone. Honestly, I would smoke so much that it just wouldn't affect me anymore. I mean, it was kind of wasteful at times. I spent a lot of money on it back in the day.
Yeah. Oh, I can imagine. If you smoke for 20 years straight, you better don't calculate how much money you spent, because you probably could have bought a car or two from that money. Yeah. So there was this really stereotypical stoner, and the stereotypical stoner is not very productive. He's not very functional. But I agree, I don't find that to be true. I know many people who are highly functional, who smoke cannabis every day, and they get by just great. They perform well at work. I don't think that must be a problem. What could be a problem is, over time, the fact that you are maybe dependent on it just because you use it every day. So, like you said, maybe it doesn't affect you anymore over time, but you actually need maybe that first joint in the morning, to get back to baseline, to feel normal. And when that sets in, then you are less free, and then maybe you should start, or one could start thinking about, okay, what is my relationship with this plant? Am I getting any benefit from it, or is it just something that I need to function normally? And when you reach that point, then maybe it's a good time to start thinking about, okay, could I be without cannabis for a while? Like you explained, like when you went on the retreat, you noticed like, yeah, okay, it's no problem. So then you just don't go back to it. But it's probably a good point, a good idea to at some point question your relationship with cannabis.
Yeah. I really appreciate that you bring up this topic of dependency. I know there were certainly times that I would have been like, dependency? What are you talking about?
Yeah.
You can't be
denial phase
dependent on marijuana. Right. I know for probably a lot of smokers, it is a bit of a hot button topic, right? There tends to be some denial there. And maybe people not everyone experiences dependency. I totally don't know. In my own experience, there definitely was some dependency, I would say, especially in terms of being able to regulate my emotions, right? Like I was totally using it as a crutch to not feel anxiety, to not feel anything that I didn't want to feel, basically to zone out. And I think, it's really effective for that. But the problem becomes that as you reduce that kind of emotional fluidity, that emotional range, you're also reducing your capacity to feel other emotions, like positive emotions, right? So for me, that was, having a hard time having much fun. I mean, I was there, I was doing things, I could be like totally zoned out or something and involved, I guess you could say. But things just weren't as fun. I had a hard time laughing at things. I had a hard time crying at things, not that I necessarily want to, but I'd say that it really reduces emotional capacity.
Mm-hmm.
What did you find around that? Was that true for your experience as well?
Oof, that's a tough one. I think it's actually, so it was definitely true for me in my 20s, I would say, like just the way I was using it, because I was using it precisely for that, to maybe shut down at the end of the day, relax, don't think about stuff, maybe avoid some feelings, go straight into some specific calm feelings that I'm always able to reproduce with cannabis. Just listen to some music, hang out with friends, these kind of things. But I think, or what I've learned is that's actually, it just depends on the way you use it, what your intention is with the use, and it doesn't have to be this way. Okay, I can tell you the next part of my experience with cannabis over the years. Later in life, I think at the end of my 20s, when I had some psychedelic experiences, especially with ayahuasca, which maybe we can talk about like in a different episode. But after that, for some reason, cannabis smoking wasn't really the same experience for me. And I actually heard other people speak about this, that this is a thing, that after you take psychedelics, cannabis is not the same anymore. In particular, for me, that meant that every time, like at the time, I had a really good relationship. I wasn't using super frequently, but had a good relationship with cannabis. And after some psychedelic experiences, I was getting anxious when smoking every time. I was getting like, I would feel a little sick. I would get paranoid. I would, maybe everybody who smoked cannabis knows about the paranoia that can come up from cannabis. I mean, you probably experienced it at some point to some degree, but it was just too elevated for me and was not fun anymore. And then I said, okay, I don't need to smoke. I mean, this is not making me feel good. Like, why would I do it? So I just tossed it. I just avoided it. I would still be around with people when they would smoke. I don't have a problem with that. But I wouldn't smoke myself. And it wasn't only until actually quite recently, like this year, when somebody pointed me to an interesting thing where I had a conversation with a friend, and he told me that cannabis is actually just amplifying whatever is already there in your experience. Maybe similarly to what psychedelics do. And he was saying that if you're like particularly anxious or paranoid on cannabis, that might be like a general problem of yours, which is just amplified when you smoke. And as soon as he framed it that way, I become interested in it, because I was already interested in shadow work, what we talked about like in the last episode. And I was actually looking for tools to, look at my emotions and unconscious material on purpose. So the idea that I could smoke cannabis and like on purpose increase some anxiety or some negative feelings was actually appealing to me. So I said, okay, then maybe I try again. Like, let me restart this whole relationship with cannabis and let me try again, but let me try this time in a different mode. Let me try to work with it in a similar way like you would work with a psychedelic. So maybe, and I started making kind of a small ceremony out of it, which means that for the first time, actually, also in my life, I would smoke alone. I think, I don't know, it never occurred to me before to smoke alone. It was just not, it was always a social thing for me. So I said, okay, what will happen when I smoke alone? And what will happen if I make it intentionally? So maybe in the same way like somebody would approach a meditation where you sit down, you make a thing out of it, you think about your intention before, you think about your dosage, and then you smoke, and then you try to reflect or meditate. And this worked incredibly well. Like, I was super surprised how well this works. Like, it seems that meditation and cannabis together, it's such a good combination that I was thrilled really to discover this. And then I also I wanted to see, okay, I cannot be the only person who has this experiences, right? This plant has been around for like millions of years, maybe longer than humans have. And there's also like a really long recorded history of cannabis use in human civilization. I think almost all the cultures were having some relationship with it. So there has to be some stuff out there where people talk about like, okay, how does this work? Like meditation and cannabis, meditation, spirituality. And I gotta say, there's not that much out there. Like if you have a look, there's Stephen Gray who talked about it, or who talks about it. He wrote a book about it, which is actually called Cannabis and Spirituality, which is also a book I do recommend. It has some of like his own work and also some essays from other people contributing, where he goes a bit of the history of spiritual use of cannabis, and where he also describes this. He would do the same thing. He would like meditate with cannabis on a weekly basis. And then I also discovered that there's some psychotherapy done with cannabis, which then after I had my own experiences made complete sense. We can also go a bit into that. But what is your experience with spirituality and cannabis? Have you ever tried to meditate with cannabis?
Yeah, absolutely. Oh boy, you hit so many interesting topics here. Yeah, I mean, certainly since I've practiced meditation for maybe 10 years or so, and since during a lot of that time I was smoking all the time, I did certainly use it in conjunction with meditation. And I found there's sort of this interesting area where it's like, well, am I actually meditating, right? Is this actually helping me meditate, or am I really just zoning out, right? There's certainly some question around that, and I would say a lot of it kind of comes down to intentionality. Like, why are you really using it, right? And you're kind of touching on this also with the talk around how it amplifies some of the underlying potentially some of the underlying problems or emotions that you might be going through. Very, very similar to psychedelics. My own experience around especially like anxiety, was I would use cannabis to try and alleviate anxiety. On a physiological level, initially, it would seem to cause more anxiety, right? It would increase my heart rate, potentially becoming paranoid, really just kind of amplifying it. But then there was a certain point where you'd smoke enough where I might guess that it starts to cause a certain amount of dissociation. right? Where you've gone past the point of feeling amped up, and now you're kind of almost in like a freeze mode, and it's almost like a numb kind of like warm, enjoyable in the sense of like, oh, I'm no longer experiencing anxiety. So for me, I think I usually took it maybe a little bit too far in that sense, in terms of just like over amplifying things to the point where I'd then dissociate. And sometimes dissociation can feel a little bit like meditation. It's like, well, my mind is quiet and I feel really numb to things. Am I meditating? Am I not meditating?
Mm-hmm.
Right. For the most part, I would say I didn't use it super effectively in terms of meditation. I would use it just a little bit too much, to the point where it would take me past kind of the sweet area. I like that you also hit on this idea of potentially using it to amplify some of what we're experiencing. This is kind of getting into more of where I've become interested recently, especially around the first topic that we touched on, like somatic experiencing and kind of amplifying those sensations almost as sort of exposure therapy, right? So I've come across this modality. I haven't personally experienced it. I just came across it on Reddit, and it sounded really interesting. So I read a number of different protocols around how to use it. In this particular therapy, it's called psychedelic somatic interactional psychotherapy, or PSIP. And it specifically, I think, uses cannabis. And the idea is you smoking just a small amount so that it really starts to amplify the body sensations and potentially even elicit unintentional movement, like shaking or surfacing of emotions. And then at that point, really, the idea is to stay present with it to the best of your ability, like with a somatic type experiencing, like, okay, what does this feel like? Feel into the body, be with it, do your best to regulate yourself and calm yourself down so that you can start to reprogram your body's response to these more extreme reactions. So I've been interested in it in that sense. I've kind of dabbled with it a little bit in that sense, and found it fairly effective. I'm kind of getting off topic of the meditation. I honestly, this does relate back to meditation a bit in a sense, because sometimes I do see meditation also as a bit of an exposure therapy, where essentially you're amplifying your awareness of an underlying discomfort, and then kind of reprogramming your response to that simply by sitting with it and not reacting.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So what do you think on this topic? I don't want to take us too far off base or off of your question around meditation.
I think it's super interesting that you mentioned PSIP. I would love to dive a bit into that, but maybe before, I think it makes sense to divide kind of cannabis use into medication and therapy, if you want. So let's say, or the useful. I mean, there's also just pleasure and play, right? That we know as well.
Sure.
But I would say that the medication use is kind of more broadly known, and this is also more popular. For example, for chronic pain, right? That it can get prescribed, and it helps quite well for chronic pain. It can help with what is the medical condition called where people have tremors all the time?
Like Parkinson's, maybe?
Parkinson's, exactly. So like strong CBD doses, for example, are really great at calming the nervous system down and like getting rid of the tremor. And I would say that all of this goes into the bucket of medication, and it's all use where you don't have to work so much with intention. It's just, it's reproducible 100% of the time. You have chronic pain, you take THC, it just works, it alleviates it. But then there's the more therapeutic use where, well, you also need to put some effort in, right? And then it's really just a tool that you can use to kind of work on your own issues. And you could work on your own issues being of psychological nature or being of somatic nature. And this is maybe where meditation ties back in, at least. So this is my experience, is when you combine cannabis and with meditation, what happens with meditation? You stop focusing on the thoughts. You go after some time out of your mind, of the stories that play in your mind all the time. Maybe the standard mode that you're in during the day. And when you combine that with cannabis, what happens is you reach the somatic layer. So I don't know if that's the right word for it, but you reach your body, you reach body awareness. And this is something which maybe cannabis users will be familiar with, kind of a body high, right? So, I mean, you know the feeling of just feeling great in your body and just being very much in your body more than being sober. And when you combine that with intentional use, what can happen then is now you have really presence and awareness in your body, and you can bring up stuff that is stuck in your body and in your nervous system. And this is what we talked about in the first episode, right? That we have this stuff stick to our nervous system from past experiences, and we need to find a modality to let the body get rid of that excess energy by shaking. There is have you heard about TRE, traumatic release experiencing? I think it's the
right. Yeah, I think maybe it's trauma release exercises.
Yes,
I
thank
think
you.
is the acronym.
But it's basically it's you trying to purposefully start shaking in the body, which then after some time becomes autonomic, which then empties the nervous system of some excess energy. And this works amazingly also with cannabis. Why? Because then you reach the somatic layer, right? And the somatic layer is also what these people at PSIP discovered, that it works so well at accessing this layer, and that in that sense, it's maybe a better tool even than psychedelics to work with trauma. Because you know that there's also studies out there who try to research psilocybin in terms of like trauma release, and then there's like a big community of people who are using ayahuasca to work on their trauma, maybe underground more. And all of these tools work great, but like when I discovered that PSIP is doing this stuff in the US, I think, and in Canada, I'm not sure. It made so much sense for me, to me. So there's actually on their website, there's videos and recordings of these sessions that they do with people, where you can see like how this works on patients, which is like super interesting. And it just, like when I learned about this, it just made click. I was like, yeah, it makes so much sense that this is such a good tool to work with trauma and to work with the body. And this stuff is already legal in many places and is going to be legalized in more places over the coming years, right? We have that. So I think from the potency level, it's as good as maybe MDMA for working with trauma. But this stuff is already legal. You don't need to legalize it. You know what MAPS is doing right now to try to bring also MDMA to legal, to legalization just for therapy of trauma. This works with stuff that is already legal and that people have experience with, and that it's already broadly accepted, I would say, in society. Now I rambled a bit about PSIP and the somatic layer.
No, it's good. It's good. Yeah. Yeah, I was going to say, around like I totally agree that it is so much more accessible than psychedelics right now. It's interesting. When I first got into psychedelics, I really wanted to use it for some of these things that now I'm understanding I could have been using cannabis for. I was using cannabis to kind of dissociate. I was using cannabis to, avoid my feelings, but I could have been using it to go deeper. And that's really why I found myself, going after psychedelics, is because I wanted to work on my trauma. I wanted to work on that hidden stuff, and I didn't know how to access it. Right. I also like that you bring up the shaking. This is something that I'm familiar with through Peter Levine, right? He's the somatic experiencing guy, right? And the way that he puts it is that animals do this naturally, right? Like if they're in an intense situation and they get out of it and they have excess energy, then they'll just shake, right? They'll just sit down and their whole body will shake and it'll release all the energy, and so it doesn't get stored in the body. I think my understanding or my guess is that it's really getting stored in the muscles, right? As like tension. And then we just kind of lose awareness of it, right? And so something like cannabis can help bring it back into our awareness. In some of my early psychedelic experiences and still today, whenever I do psychedelics, I usually experience some amount of involuntary shaking, and I kind of just let it do its own thing, right? Afterwards, it kind of feels like I had a really good body work or something. It's the body giving itself a massage or something, right? And cannabis, yeah, it does do the same thing at the right dosage, right? I think dosage is really important in this case. In my experience, it's very easy to overdo cannabis, especially since it's become legalized. And I mean, the potency is just like incredible these days. I mean, when I first started using cannabis, it wasn't legal and it wasn't as accessible. I mean, you could still get really good stuff. You'd be getting it through a friend of a friend or whatever, somebody who's growing clandestinely somewhere, who knows where, right? And you can still get pretty good stuff, but these days, walking into a shop, I mean, you get extremely high potent stuff, especially people doing like the extracts in particular are just like, I mean, it's just too much, honestly, at least in my experience, right? To use it in a therapeutic way, it does not take very much, right? Like pretty small dosages seem to be pretty effective. They start getting you into the body. They start giving you access to, like you were saying, that somatic layer, and they start eliciting, potentially emotional experiences as well as, body experiences, like your body shaking or involuntary muscle movements, right? And those are actually potentially really, really beneficial if you're able to just allow it to happen, allow the body to kind of unwind and do what it needs to do to release some of that excess, that trapped energy, just be really beneficial. Even just talking about it makes me, interested in experimenting a little bit more with it. Now I haven't done a ton of experimenting myself.
Yeah. And so what we talked about the PSIP is it works kind of in a relational way, right? There needs to be a therapist present that works with you so that you can fully relax, and kind of the therapist is there to walk you through some maybe traumatic memories and stuff. But I feel that it can very well be done also solo. Maybe, it wouldn't work in the same way like with PSIP, but I think there's much potential for people to also work with it on a solo basis, like without a therapist. And anyways, people are smoking out there all day, every day, some people. Why not bring forward some kind of framework where how people could work themselves and start working in it in a spiritual way? And by spiritual, I mean when you smoke it, treating it like, okay, this is the spirit of cannabis, or the energy or whatever you want to call it, and I'm going to work with this now. I think this is what I mean by spiritual. And okay, so if we are offering that there's a possibility that you can work with cannabis on a one-on-one level, let's say, let's talk about maybe also like strains and dosages. What is your experience with sativa versus indica?
Yeah, generally I've moved towards the sativa side of things, just in terms of like personal preference. Overall, my experience, I mean, like most people, I notice indica tends to be a little bit more on the body side, and sativa tends to be a little bit more on the cerebral side, the mental side. And I've just found, I found a number of strains that I just personally really like. Blue Dream in particular has always been one of my favorites, just for the effects in general. As far as like from a therapeutic level, I probably can't speak to that very well. I'd be curious what your thoughts are on that.
It's a tough one.
Sativa versus indica.
So for me personally, when I use it kind of ceremonially, I would go for sativa because it is more energizing, and I generally have the problem with indicas that I tend to fall asleep or relax so much that it's more like dissociation. So then it's like less useful. But I've also read posts online of people who are saying that if you want a really psychedelic blend, let's say, the best thing to do would be to combine different strains. And the idea is that you kind of get the positive effects of like both strains or of even like multiple strains combined, and that this actually makes the strain even more psychedelic in a sense. So this is something I'm experimenting with. Like instead of just smoking like a singular strain, I'm trying to like mix two of them and then like see, okay, how does that work in a different way? But it is a very complex field, and we're just at the beginning of understanding cannabis properly because there's so many cannabinoids in there. And then what they realized recently is that it's not only relevant what is the cannabinoids, but it's also what is the terpene profile. And then I don't know, you can also go into so there's this thing called the entourage effect. Have you heard about that?
Sounds vaguely familiar. I don't think I could speak to it very well. What is it?
When CBD was popularized a couple years back, then you had these CBD, let's say, distillates or isolates, where it was really just a pure compound. And then there was the strains where it was just like a cannabis strain where CBD would be the dominant cannabinoid, but the other ones would still be present, but just in a very low dose. And then people would claim that this is what they call the entourage effect, that if the other ones are present, not very strong, it makes the CBD much more stronger. And I think the same applies also for THC, right? But on the other hand, also there's companies who now try to isolate that you can have like pure THC distillate. And there's in Germany, for example, at the moment, it's popular to buy artificially produced cannabinoids like HHC, THCV, THCP, just because they are not on the blacklist of drugs that are illegal at the moment. So you can still buy them until the state catches up and illegalizes them a couple of months later, and then new cannabinoid comes out. So there's a lot of artificially produced cannabinoids on the market which are not researched very well, actually, but people smoke it because they have a similar effect to THC, and it's legal, so they can get it. So it's better to maybe buy it off the street. It can also, I think, have a harmful effect if you try these artificially produced variants of cannabinoids. And also what I'm learning is that the growing conditions seem to influence like the quality of the cannabis. So it's, it's so much to learn about it. I'm at the beginning still.
Right. Yeah. We could go on so many different tangents here. To bring us back to this idea of intentional use, what dosage? I mean, for me, I've found like if I want to use it in an intentional way, just like one or two hits, fairly small hits even, are more than enough to really put me into that space. What have you found?
I would say the more focus you put into the experience, or the more attention, let's say like in meditation, then you would just need a little dose.
Yeah.
But so it's how to explain. So it's kind of on the low dose end. You can work very much with thoughts and the mental sphere. And at higher doses, it's more about feeling anything that is beyond the mind, anything that is almost transpersonal, non-dual. You can almost enter into this non-dual space of just feeling. I don't know. Terence McKenna recommends just smoke so much that you think that you overdone yourself and then you're at the right point. There's different recommendations, but I think whatever you feel comfortable with to start with.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And I think one of the other important aspects of using it, like for spiritual purposes, is really using it with intentionality, right? Really setting aside a certain container, setting aside certain time, going into it with a specific intention, like why am I using it? What am I going to do during this time? I think are also some of the other ways to make effective intentional use. Right. Can you think of any other aspects, any other particular practices that really help contribute to, positive intentional use?
Ceremony for me. So when I say ceremony, I mean that you think about, okay, how does the experience start? How does it end? And this could be that you prepare your space. You maybe have a nice cozy space in a similar way like you would do with yoga or a meditation. That whatever it is, some people like to use incense to create a sense, and just have an intentional beginning, but also an intentional end, that you don't just drift off and do it like for hours and hours, but that you say, okay, now I'm starting to get sober and now I'm closing the experience, and then the next time you're going to work again intentionally. And I think this ceremoniality, if that's even a word, that brings also some more intention to it. And other than that, I guess what would be nice to mention to people is the whole set and setting idea that you would recommend to people who use psychedelics. Make sure that your mindset is also a good one, that you feel relaxed and well enough to go into an experience which potentially might be challenging, because potentially it might bring up stuff that you have suppressed for a while. All these things can happen. So yeah, make sure that you're in a good mindset, that you are in a surrounding where you can relax, where you don't do it probably at a festival or something. It's not a good point to do it intentionally or ceremonially, right? So yeah, have a comfortable space, I would say.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And it makes sense that you could really apply so many of the principles that you use for set and setting, for psychedelic experiences, for cannabis experiences. Once you're actually like in the experience, what do you do at that point? Like, so emotions are coming up, maybe weird body movements are coming up or something. What's the protocol at that point? What's the approach, in your experience?
Try not to judge, try to observe, and try to allow, try not to block. Pretty much anything that people recommend for meditation applies here, I would say. So that's actually a good thing. If you experience meditator, this stuff is so much easier. But that's not to say that other people cannot also do this. I mean, I think this is a skill you can learn. But basically, just allow to whatever wants to come up, and know that it will also go away, right? So whatever comes up is not there to stay. And if you do that, and if you get some practice in with that, the cool thing is some of the stuff will come up if you really fully allow it, invite it into your body or into experience or whatever. That's sometimes all these suppressed experiences want, and then it might leave you forever, in the sense that it will leave your body and it will not cost you energy anymore to be suppressed. Like similarly to what we talked about in the last episode with shadow work, right? It's kind of a similar thing happening. But yeah, basically you could read a manual for meditation, and it would apply to working with cannabis, if you ask me.
Yeah, I really like that idea. I'd also throw in there any other approaches that you might use in somatic experiencing, where you're basically, I mean, it's the same thing essentially, where you're paying attention to it, you're allowing it to happen. Very similar to the protocol for TRE that you mentioned earlier, where basically you're just allowing it to happen, and you're just sort of witnessing it, allowing the body to do whatever it needs to do to release.
Exactly. And ideally, if you allow, then ideally what will happen at the end of such a session is that you will come you will very calm and centered. And I think this is a good kind of a guiding point that this is how you should feel when you finish a session, let's say. You will be very calm. You'll feel regulated. That doesn't mean that the next time, you go on a journey, there might be more stuff coming up, but usually it ends up with a calm and relaxed state, which for me at least, is not the default always. So it's very nice experience to have.
Yeah. I like that. So what are some things that you do to kind of ground yourself after one of these experiences? Say that it leaves you not feeling calm or something. What can people do?
Yeah, there's a lot of things you can do. I guess people have their preferences. My preferences, then I would need to meditate. Any kind of, I do cold showers. It's maybe a bit counterintuitive. Maybe it's not grounding for people. For me personally, it is. So it helps me like discharge maybe excess energy. Breath work helps big time to clear out stuff from the body. I don't know. Can you also give some of your recommendations for grounding?
Yeah. So we talked about a few things in the first episode, but even things like just eating, preferably something a little bit lighter and healthier can be very, very grounding, right? Maybe you go outside into nature, sit in the grass and just chill out. Maybe listen to some music that can be fairly grounding for people. Feeling into the body, safe places in the body, just noticing, the feeling of the couch or wherever you might be sitting, that can also be very grounding. You can take a warm bath if you don't like cold showers or something, right? That could potentially help as well. Just treating yourself well, I think is important. And that kind of brings us to this idea of integration, which I think, obviously a term typically used in the psychedelic sphere, but I think it certainly applies here, applies to meditation as well, arguably. What are there any particular tactics that you use to integrate one of these experiences afterwards, like journaling? I know we hit on some of this with the shadow work talk. What do you do?
Yeah, definitely. So that's maybe one thing to have that's very useful to have ready when you embark on such a session. Maybe have a notebook, pen and paper there, and write down stuff. And then, it's the next time it's actually interesting to read it for me, because it's a little bit like dream journaling, where maybe you wake up in the middle of the night and you like note down quickly whatever you saw in the dream, and then the next day you go through it and you're like, okay, what the hell was that? Like, it doesn't make so much sense. And it can be similar with journaling during these sessions, where the next day you check the notes. But it's actually good because it will take you back to some of the insights that you gained during the session. That's actually a big thing. What happens for me when I use cannabis in this way, I a lot of the times have really insights either about myself, about my life, about life in general, that feel very important, at least in that moment, to me. And this is really cool if you can note them down, and then the next day, you can just read through and try to reflect on them from a sober perspective. That's really interesting.
Yeah. I really like that you hit on that idea of reflecting on it from a sober perspective. I think that it's really valuable to revisit the lessons that you learn from different states of mind, right? And I would even say potentially, maybe the next morning. In the morning, you tend to be in a slightly different state than you are at different points throughout the day. So maybe you revisit it in the morning, maybe you revisit it, midday or in the evening, revisit it from different states that you get into later. And I think that can really help you see it from different angles and help you integrate those lessons, right? And help deepen the insights even, I'd say.
Exactly. What else could we touch on? We didn't reach it yet, but I would really like to shout out Ryan Sprague. Have you heard about him?
No, I haven't. Who is he?
from the US, and he's working with cannabis. I think he's working in the cannabis industry, and he has a blog called Highly Optimized. And in general, he's pushing forward the idea of conscious cannabis use, which maybe is not directly in the alleyway what we were talking about when we say like spirituality, but he advocates a lot for a healthy relationship with cannabis. You know, he's trying to break the stereotype stoner, what we talked about in the beginning of being like super unproductive and so on, because this guy is really super productive. And he also has a podcast, and he also does breathwork sessions in combination with cannabis. Like I did this with him and Chris August and Aaron Epke like 1 month ago, and this was super crazy. So they invite you to smoke before. It was a remote session. There's also some live ones, I think in Texas these days. But anyways, you smoke cannabis, and then there's a guided breathwork session, which is a bit like, let's say, Wim Hof breathing, but maybe a bit extended. And it's a super crazy experience, especially when you do it kind of in a group thing, and then there's a sharing at the end. And it was just really nice to see that there's people in the cannabis industry who are not only about profit or in the medication alley, but who understand, or who seem to understand this stuff what we talked about today. So I do recommend people check him out, check out Highly Optimized, and generally his content about conscious cannabis.
Yeah, that's really cool. I would definitely say that conscious cannabis use intersects with what we're talking about today in terms of intentional use. I'd say those two things are really synonymous. So yeah, it's really cool to hear that there are people out there really looking at it from that perspective. It does, I mean, the industry in the United States has really exploded since it's legalized, right? And so much of it does seem very commercial these days. So it's refreshing to hear that there's people using it in a more consciously productive and arguably spiritual way.
Yeah, I heard that you have a crazy industry in the US. I'm super excited, to be honest, because supposedly next year it's going to be legal over here. In the beginning, it will be in a non-commercial way, so that you can that people will not be able to profit off of it. But it will be the first time that you can get like regulated, cannabis, right? Controlled cannabis, that it's not sprayed with anything, that it's not produced in some criminal environment. And I'm super excited to see how it will develop over here. Let's see where this goes next year.
Yeah, that's interesting. And just so folks know, by over here, you're talking about Germany, right? Cool.
Yeah, exactly. There's the law has been is not passed, but right now the conditions of the law are being discussed, and supposedly it was going to start in January. I think it's going to be postponed maybe by a couple of months, but early next year we expect in Germany for it to be decriminalized, and also to be able to buy up to, I think they're still discussing it, between 25 and 50 gram a month, and to be able to hold 2 plants or grow 2 plants in your home. So yeah, then maybe I'm going to ask you for some advice on growing to get that 10 feet plant in my house.
Cool. Yeah. Oh, that sounds really exciting. I know when cannabis first started getting decriminalized and legalized in the United States, so it was kind of exciting. People are getting their medical cards, because that was initially the way that you could access it. And yeah, what a time to be alive.
Exactly. Didn't see that coming like 15 years ago when I started smoking.
Right. Cool. Well, that's probably a good place to end the episode. Thanks so much for talking about this. It was an enjoyable topic today.